Hey Mike, how's it going?
Things are going great. How are you doing, Blake?
I'm good.
Things are good over at Foreign Policy?
Things are good at FP. We just put out the new issue, so it's time to party, time to relax.
Excellent.
How's you're up in New York?
Boston. Beautiful day up here.
Really?
Yes.
That must be the first beautiful day in months.
So what do we got on the agenda today?
Well, I know that you're really excited about last week's missile defense satellite test thing, so...
Very excited, absolutely. Every American should be very excited.
Why is that?
Well, this is a huge success. All those tax dollars that have gone into this system, it looks like the thing works. And
but do you think there were really people that were worried that we couldn't hit a satellite out of space the same way the Chinese did?
Well, it's certainly that we did this in 1985 with a I think it was an F-15 knocked the satellite out. But I think the difference between what they've done before and what they did this time and what the Chinese did was this was at a significantly lower orbit, I believe, because the key to this, right, was that the debris didn't stay up in space, and when the Chinese did it, this became a huge issue, is how much debris was up there, what the risk was to the space station, what the risk was to communication satellites, etc.
Right, and the Chinese basically said, we don't care, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was really interesting that, I think it was General Cartwright who pointed out the differences between the way the U.S. handled this and the way the Chinese handled it. They were trying to make the point about having a transparent military, and the U.S. said, well, we disclosed everything, every step of the way, and we said we were going to do this, and we did it. You guys, the Chinese, you did it in secret, and then you only fessed up to it because it leaked out into the press.
Right, and I think it's worth noting that this was and the point I made on my blog was that this was a huge PR coup for missile defense, and like one can honestly look at this and say, were we really worried about this tank of hydrazine? Was there really some threat?
I think the answer is pretty clearly no.
The answer is probably no, right? But it was a huge PR coup, and our friend who we mentioned last time, Tim Johnson, linked to blog China Matters, which is an interesting blog, and they said that one of the big issues in China right now is what a disaster theirs was relative to ours. So even if you sort of say, well, we were doing the same thing, and well, look, we're always getting outplayed by the Chinese on PR stuff. This is a constant complaint about the Bush administration, is their inadequacy at doing these kind of things. And here they managed a total PR coup. They managed to play the whole thing as if it was like some effort to keep us Earthlings safe from falling.
And do you think
chemicals.
People believe that? Because all the commentary I saw was just, this is a pretty thinly veiled missile defense test.
Well, you got to stop reading those liberal lefty blogs. I think it played pretty well in the mainstream news. It was much more favorable coverage than I'm accustomed to seeing of missile defense in the news.
Well, that probably has a lot to do with, it was neat, it was like a really cool technology story, and, probably a lot of, Star Wars buffs were pretty excited about some real Star Wars action.
It was a cool, the whole thing was cool. They hit this satellite, they used the missile defense technology. Now, was it really, look, I wrote that missile defense works, that this was proof that missile defense works. It might have been a little bit tongue-in-cheek.
That was a little much.
But look, it was a huge success for the system. They showed it could work under real world conditions. People gripe that they delayed the shoot because of choppy seas, and well, there aren't going to be choppy seas when the North Koreans attack necessarily. Or people say, well, there were no dummies, there were no dummy warheads, there were no any kind of thing that would.
That all seems pretty valid to me. I think the thing that I've come to understand is that it's a lot cheaper to develop countermeasures when you're talking about missile defense than it is to build the actual missile defense system itself. Because that's what I worry about on the technical side. I also have kind of diplomatic worries, but on the technical side, my understanding is that we still don't know how to account for a missile system, an enemy's missile system that can evade the missile defense. They can throw out chaff, aluminum foil, whatever it is.
Yeah, no, but there is the idea that, look, obviously missile defense is far more expensive than the countermeasures. But at the same time, these countermeasures are not terribly cheap. The countermeasures of the type that would sort of have different bits of the missile go in different directions, these are very expensive things that the Russians played around with. It's not as easy to do as one might think to create an effective countermeasure. And of course, if you can hit, one thing going at 17,000 miles an hour or whatever it is, look, if the technology has gotten as far as it is, I don't see why there's any reason to doubt that it can go further. I mean, I think it would be foolish not to invest in it and just keep pushing along. And I think this is sort of one of those moments that people will look back on and say, this is why missile defense sort of survived, because this was the first time that there had any real-world application. I mean, short of somebody actually firing a missile at us and this thing shooting it down, I mean, this is the best we were going to get for a real-world test.
There was that Bruce Willis movie, right, with the asteroid?
No, I mean, an asteroid could be good for the Missile Defense Agency, too. Some real threat to humanity, our way of life, would be good for them.
I'm surprised there hasn't been a lot of commentary by the political candidates about this, I would have expected to see more, missile defense work stuff from John McCain, and I don't know, maybe the Democrats don't have anything to say about it. But
no, I absolutely agree. I think Republicans would be absolutely foolish not to use this to beat up Democrats, because Obama can't really come out and say, "Oh, I love missile defense and this thing works." But the perception at the moment is that, geez, this was really effective and this worked, and regardless of whether it's an actual real-world simulation of what's striking, or whether this is something we couldn't have achieved without missile defense technology, the perception is there that this was a huge success. So I would think McCain would be out there, talking about it. But
what was really strange this past week was McCain actually criticizing Obama at the same time as there was this, predator strike on this third in command of Al Qaeda. You had the specter of McCain actually criticizing Obama for being too hawkish on Pakistan, which I thought was unusual. And then you had, this guy David Ferdoso at the National Review say, "Well, McCain's right on. This is something that the United States ought to be a lot more careful about," which is kind of a role reversal. You'd expect, the Democrat to be a lot more dovish, if you will. I think
it's the dissonance, though, right? I mean, why is Obama out there being so hawkish on Pakistan and so defeatist on Iraq? And I think Republicans can make some hay out of it, but I do see what you're saying, and I think it is sort of, we should encourage them to be hawkish when they'll be hawkish, and I'm certainly not going to beat up Barack for saying that he wants to consider sending ground troops into Pakistan. Good for him.
that would be pretty foolish, but I think Obama. There are going to be more issues where he takes a position to the right of McCain. Like, for instance, I don't know if you saw this this past week, but Liechtenstein, small principality in Europe, tax haven. If Obama wanted to carve out a position of McCain's right, he could say, "Let's invade Liechtenstein." They've been in trouble with the Germans for not being transparent about their dealings with German tax evaders. So there's a country, it's 35,000 people. They've got basically no armed forces. I think it's a great target for Obama to
Wait, is the German war machine threatening Liechtenstein? Did I miss this story?
No. It's actually the Liechtensteinians are complaining that the Germans are acting like the Gestapo. The Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, who's sort of the acting ruler, said that and he eventually apologized. But I think it's an issue where Obama could, revitalize some ties with an old European ally and stake out a position of McCain's right. I mean, McCain is not going to want to invade Liechtenstein, so there you go.
No, look, I'm all for it. I think Obama has been, he is a totally conventional Orthodox liberal, and if he's going to be competitive in a general election, look, I know everyone's saying, well, he's out in front of McCain in the polls now, and he's obviously a very formidable opponent, but no, I think he will have to stake out a few positions further to the right, and I think the Gitmo issue is actually one issue where he's sort of been a bit ridiculous.
What do you mean?
I'm trying to remember what the quote was exactly. he said in the debate that he was going to bring it up to the highest standards of human rights and close Guantanamo Bay, right? But that phrase
that's the same thing Bush said.
Well, but obviously it means something different when Bush says it. No, when he said apply the highest standards, right? I mean, basically the highest standards for this would be American civilian criminal courts, right? I mean, that is the highest standard. That's the gold standard. So
the problem with that is it's probably too late. I mean, they had this whole thing with the FBI clean teams that were going to go in, or they did go in and re-interrogate, a couple of the key detainees in order that they could prosecute them through the military tribunal process. But that's in the military tribunal process. If you try to do that with civilian courts, the risk would just be that these, the worst of the worst guys would get off for procedural reasons.
No, exactly. I think that's exactly true. But McCain has moved to the right on this of late, and he's all of a sudden sort of dropped his objections to the interrogation techniques and whatnot, or at least not speaking of them quite as much. And I actually think this is a place where both of them could move to the right and sort of do well. I just don't see. I think it would be, people are going to worry about Obama's credentials as sort of commander-in-chief during this, and I think if he goes out there and says, look, I don't have any plans to sort of put these people in civilian courts, or I just think he could move to the right on that. I think McCain has moved to the right on that. I think everyone would benefit from that.
And also, I think there are a couple of countries where Obama could stake out a different position than McCain. Like, he hasn't really said much about Saudi Arabia. There have been some, pretty egregious human rights violations in Saudi Arabia recently. There's also China. China's not very popular among the Democratic base for trade reasons. Obama can do a lot of China bashing on human rights and trade. And where McCain's been, McCain's had some shifting positions over the years on China. He used to be part of that whole Chris Cox, China Hawks crowd. And now you read McCain's foreign affairs piece, and it's very much, engagement. We need to be prepared, but we need to engage with China. Pretty much the same position that every president takes when they get into office. McCain's sort of been around the block enough that he knows that, China is a big country. The U.S. needs its help on so many issues. They can't afford to, go around beating up on China. But when you're a presidential candidate...
Wait, Blake, I want to bring up... So I was reading your blog, and I saw that you said late last week, right? You said, so can we stop calling China a communist country, right?
They're not. I mean, there's a communist party running it, but, if you...
So what are they?
They are a capitalist, bureaucratic autocracy.
Can we call that fascism?
No, they're not a fascist. They're incredibly repressive. Don't get me wrong. I have no illusions about how repressive the Chinese state is. But that said, any China expert will tell you that they're by no means as a totalitarian state the way they were under Mao. Things are a lot different. There's a lot more space for Chinese citizens, not to politically organize, but to just have some control over their own lives, and that's meaningful. That said, they're not going to democratize anytime soon, and their leaders of the Communist Party have made that very clear. So they've got this kind of hybrid, statist capitalistic system. China is growing hugely, enormously. Still, it's going to slow down this year, but it'll still be around 10% growth. So, that's not something a communist country would pull off.
No, I agree with you. It's not a communist country anymore, but it certainly sort of looks more and more fascist as time progresses, right?
I think less fascist. I don't know. I mean, I think that they're sort of fighting this rearguard action. There's been a lot of protests over the last few years. There's something like, I think, 100,000 demonstrations in 2007, according to the government's own statistics. So there is a lot of political movement.
Right, but aren't they cracking down on these? I mean, you make it sound like there are people out in the streets demonstrating and they're sort of allowed to. I mean, that's not exactly
of course they're not allowed to.
Cracking heads.
Of course they're cracking heads. but they're not like mowing people over with tanks, the way they were.
Well, that's because a lot of the people support the system, I think. And, I mean, it was the same way in Nazi Germany. I mean, it wasn't like the Nazis had to mow down their own people in tanks to keep order. They were pretty willing to sort of, they had freedom as far as economic freedom. And, as long as you weren't Jewish or whatever, you had a lot of freedom. I think it was struck me as I read your post, like, well, if they're not a communist country, that's certainly a long... you have like a sentence-long definition for it. I think it'd be simpler to use a short label like fascist.
I really disagree. I mean, there's a huge difference historically between where China is and where Germany is. I mean, Germany was an autarky. They were trying to control resources militarily, and that's one of the reasons that they moved into Eastern Europe, and they tried to get the Romanian oil fields and so on. And seized the Caucasus. That's why they attacked the Soviet Union. China has grown because of trade, and because a lot of countries have located they've outsourced their manufacturing to China. So China is like deeply connected to the global economy and dependent upon it.
Right, but they also use. I mean, look at what they're doing in Africa. I mean, they basically go into these places and trade like the most odious regimes that are out there, arms and all types of things, so that they can have access to natural resources. They go do business. We try and pressure Europeans to move away from Iran. And what does China do? They go in and fill the gap and sort of make money off it.
Of course, they're not stupid. Look, the Chinese are not ideological, and they'll do what they feel like they need to do. But I think the U.S. has its own problems in Africa. They announced last week that AFRICOM was not going to be the new strategic command for Africa for the U.S. military was not going to be headquartered in Africa. It's going to be headquartered in Germany. The whole point of it was to separate out a command from EUCOM, the European command that was running Africa. And if they're going to be in Germany anyway, what's the difference? And that says to me that the U.S. has a lot of problems in Africa, and that the Chinese have been.
Well, Africa has a lot of problems. I mean, I think the Bush administration actually has a fantastic record in Africa. It's one of the few real bright spots, for their foreign policy. Their sort of AIDS outreach stuff has been real successful, and I mean we saw that when Bush was in Africa. He was pretty warmly received.
Yeah, we did a little photo essay about it. He got a little medal when he went to Liberia. He was
it all looked very good. It's been a good couple weeks for Bush, I think.
But the bottom line is he didn't get any country to sign off on a basing agreement. Except for Liberia, which offered it. I'm not sure why the U.S. Didn't want to take up their offer. I think probably the Nigerians. Are deemed much more strategically important, and the Nigerians didn't want to see a U.S. base in the region. But the bottom line is that the U.S. needs to be a lot more savvy about how it competes with the Chinese in places like Africa. A lot of these countries, they see the U.S. coming in there and being very heavy-handed in the advice that it offers.
Because, it's tough to be savvy.
Conditions, and for better or worse, a country is going to take the Chinese offer to just build the road, and be happy to accept that. With
it's tough to be savvy when you don't have an amoral foreign policy. It's much easier to go in there and say we'll do business with whoever. We'll help them stay in power. We'll help them suppress any type of rebellious elements within their country, and then in return we get the oil. Who's not going to take that deal in Africa?
They're all obviously very interesting. I mean, it's also interesting though that the Chinese have gotten some flack, of their own. There was an incident in I think Zambia last year where the miners were demonstrating against the Chinese. There have been actually a number of attacks against Chinese oil workers in Sudan, from groups aligned with the Darfur groups and aligned with the southern Sudanese groups. So. I think China's found out that it's not all gumdrops and lollipops there, and there's of course the Olympics, which is Steven Spielberg quitting, and all of a sudden there's this huge PR disaster for them, linking the Olympics to Darfur. Very positive.
No, this is great. This is like one of the few times Hollywood's ever actually gone after real human rights abusers instead of fictional.
Well, China, I mean, in fairness to Hollywood, they've always had a problem with China. What was interesting is that Steven Spielberg even agreed to do this at all. There's in this whole like pro-Tibet, faction in Hollywood, and I'm surprised that frankly, that Spielberg even waited this long, or that he even got involved in the first place, knowing, just how anti-China, how strong the anti-China sentiment is in Hollywood.
Well, it'll certainly be interesting when the Olympics roll around and that sort of filters into the presidential race. That's going to be very interesting. So let's talk presidential race. Should we talk about why the Obamas hate America?
I don't think the Obamas hate America. I mean, not necessarily my candidate, but I think Michelle Obama needs to be more careful, obviously, on the campaign trail. Now all of a sudden, people are digging into. I think the Politico did an article about her, her thesis at Princeton, stuff like that. I mean, it's politics.
What do you make of those comments that this is the first time in her life that she's really been proud of America?
Well, she's explained it as that she's, the first time in her life that she's been proud of the politics of America. So, who am I to say what she means or what she doesn't mean?
Doesn't that strike you as a little bit like egocentric, that the first time she's proud of the politics of America is when the politics of America embraces her husband? That's like the only thing that could bring her around?
I mean, I'm not going to try to psychoanalyze Michelle Obama. I don't really know, much about her. I mean, I do see that this is going to be a pretty potent attack, and I'll tell you, look, there was this article in the Politico today about how the Republican Party is very nervous and sending out word, to be very careful about the comments that they make, because, that Barack Obama is black, and they don't want things to be interpreted as racist.
No, look, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that. I mean, it is. This is a real issue for Republicans. Look, Hillary goes out and puts this picture out there today, right?
Right.
Can you imagine what would happen if Republicans did that? I mean, it would be like a total backlash. Actually, I read something interesting where someone was saying, look, Hillary Clinton, she's not getting away with it. She's getting beat up for this stuff. But it's like she's doing sort of the GOP's dirty work by putting this stuff out there. And really, the only saving grace will be that the GOP can turn around and say, look, Hillary did this and worse. At the end of the day, though, it is going to be ugly. I mean, but Obama's going to accuse people of smearing him and dirty tricks and sort of imply that it's racism and that kind of thing, regardless of what form the attacks take, I think, which is smart on his part. It's going to be extremely difficult for conservative bloggers, though, to not come off as, racist. It's just going to be a real minefield.
And the thing is, nowadays, you can, any conservative blog or liberal blog can blog something, and then it gets front paged on Drudge or whatever, and then suddenly, people aren't necessarily careful about who they're attributing blame, to. So, some commenter on Daily Kos can say something, stupid about John McCain, and then, then it gets, mentioned on Drudge, and it gets into an article in the New York Times, and suddenly it's like liberals are doing this, or some commenter on, redstate.org or whatever. The same thing can happen.
Actually, I mean, look, I don't see any overt racism out there. I certainly don't see it.
What about the Muslim stuff? I mean,
well, the Muslim stuff. I mean, I'll tell you, I was out to dinner with some family friends the other night, and they're older people, and the woman reaches across me at the table and says, "So do you think Obama's a Muslim?" And look, I mean, it's out there. I mean, obviously, it's complete nonsense, but I sort of feel like
it's not going away. I mean,
it's not going away. I mean, Jon Stewart last night. You got to think there are a lot of people in the crowd at the Oscars who are not pleased with his Barack Hussein Obama riff.
I missed that. What did he say?
He said, look, the guy's got the middle name as the dictator we just knocked off, and his last name rhymes with Osama, and he's sort of like, he totally aired it out. Now, is he inoculating Barack from this kind of thing down the line? Maybe a little bit, but I imagine that there were a lot of people in the audience who did not find that funny.
Probably so. I mean, I think CNN has actually a few times, inadvertently thrown up captions that spelled Obama like Osama.
Well, no, we were questioning this. The new Fox News poll asked Americans who they thought Osama would favor in the election.
Did they ask that question?
Yeah, they asked that question. Of course, Barack Obama won. And of course, Think Progress goes out there then and says, blames Fox for this. Well, look, they asked the question. Americans think he would prefer Obama. Who's to say he wouldn't?
Well, FoxNews.com website readers.
No, it's a real poll. It was an opinion dynamics poll, but they used the spelling Usama with the U instead of the O, which I thought was interesting. I wonder whether whether mainstream media organizations might not switch their style.
That's the old school spelling. That was like the spelling that they used in the 90s.
It's the spelling he prefers. That's my understanding, anyway. So let's see. So we've covered why the Obamas hate America. We've covered missile defense. What else do we got?
What about? I'm kind of interested in what's going on in Pakistan. I've actually been pretty critical of the Bush administration. Shocking, I know. For basically hanging on to Musharraf after this election. It looks pretty clear. Like what happened was Musharraf tried his best to cheat in order to win, and the army didn't do what it needed to do to put him over the top, and he was the tide was just too strong. He was crushed, and that's actually a pretty good thing. We have these two civilian parties, the PPP and the PMLN, which are pretty crappy parties, and they're run by pretty venal, corrupt guys. But this is what the whole war on terrorism long-term strategy is supposed to be about, is promoting democracy, and that's something that I think the Bush administration has gotten away from for understandable reasons. But I think the original concept of promoting democracy as a long-term strategy against terrorism was a good one. And so I'm just sort of mystified why even after this election happened, they're still clinging on to Pervez Musharraf, who basically is going to get all of his, if he's not kicked out by the parliament or the restored Supreme Court, he's going to get all of his powers stripped, and he's not going to be that useful to the United States anyway. Meanwhile, you've got this new guy, Asif Kiani, who's the Army Chief of Staff, who seems pretty competent, and he seems pretty apolitical, and he seems like a guy that the United States ought to be happy to work with. So I just don't understand why they're clinging on to Pervez.
Well, geez, I'm not sure I could offer any kind of satisfactory answer for that. But look, I can just tell you that I think within the conservative within the conservative movement, there is a lot of mixed opinion or just outright lack of opinion on this. I think people are genuinely confused about how to go about doing this. It's a special case, obviously, because of the nuclear weapons. But it's interesting. This is one place where you cannot find a uniform opinion on either side about how to proceed. Maybe the left is sort of uniformly like, whatever the Bush administration's doing is a disaster, and Musharraf's a disaster, and but I don't see anyone out there offering really good solutions. You could switch the devil you know for the devil you don't know. But I don't think, are we really talking about democracy around the corner here in Pakistan? That's not the case.
Well, no, we're not talking about, democracy in the way that you and I think about it. But look, what's already happened this week is the insurgencies in Liechtenstein and the northwestern frontier provinces calmed down. And they're looking at these new political parties and going, is there something we can do to work out some kind of, political arrangement with them? And that's pretty interesting. And then you look at India, and India's saying, wow, this new civilian government, we can work with them. We want to make some progress on the outstanding issues with Pakistan. If you take Kashmir off the table, and granted, nothing's going to happen soon. We're talking about the next few years. But if Pakistan and India are able to cut a deal on Kashmir, I think that could be hugely important for undercutting all these jihadi groups that operate and have relationships with groups in Kashmir. So I think there is an impact. I'm not going to go out and say that these parties are going to be wonderful Jeffersonian Democrats, but I think that it's a huge opportunity.
I'd like to think you're right. I mean, Kashmir is just one of those issues, though, that I don't see how a government survives making a deal on Kashmir that's acceptable to the Indians and acceptable to their own.
The Indians are probably the bigger burden. Bigger problem because seeing the Prime Minister of India is pretty weak right now. The U.S.-India nuclear deal has sort of really weakened him, and the left there has really gone after him and almost brought his government down over that. So, if there's anyone who is not able to cut a deal, it's probably Singh.
I would say, though, that there's reason to be optimistic on India. I mean, we see that there is a real wedge that's been driven between them and their Russian arms suppliers, and
we're selling them. What are we selling them?
What's that?
What's the United States selling them? Like Bob Gates just went there and he's.
Well, Bob Gates was just in Australia where they're asking for F-22s, which I thought was interesting.
And the Japanese want F-22s too.
I know. I wish we could give them to these people. I don't know. I don't understand what the problem on the Hill is. Maybe it's the Democrats.
No, well, we're supposed to keep the best planes, right, and then only sell the second best planes.
Yeah, no, this Joint Strike Fighter is going to be a disaster, I fear. But I would note that there was an interesting piece on our website by Reuben Johnson about the possibility of sending the Kitty Hawk to India because they've long sort of sought a Russian carrier that was to be refitted and to be armed and et cetera, et cetera. But the Russians, they're at a real impasse negotiating this thing after billions have already been spent, and it looks like...
Sending them as in, like, selling it to them?
Yeah, giving it to them if they buy Boeing airplanes to put on it. It's a little military-industrial complex sweetheart deal, it sounds like, but it could have a real, it could have a real impact on foreign policy if you really sort of close the gap there on some of these defense deals, bring the communities a little bit, bring the militaries a little closer together, more interoperable. There's a huge upside to that kind of thing, I think.
They got a lot of people in India too.
Yeah, I worry we're going over our time limit here.
Okay,
but we got anything else, or is that cover it for today?
I think that does the trick.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Blake.
Likewise, and see you next time.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope so. All right, thank you.
All right, cheers.
Later, buddy.